between those that see, this is about a government take over the internet. We've also got people on the other side of the argument that think that their societies are being substantially undermined by the presence of the internet in their societies in an unregulated fashion that is undermining their governmental ability and responsibility to regulate their societies, and replacing it with a completely unregulated intervention of Western and principally American corporate interests. And more than that, more even than those corporate interests, the values and expectations that they bring with them, and the refusal to be regulated according to certain standards and values, and to impose certain regulatory norms that exist in many societies. And here we're talking about countries that often do not share, certainly, the values that underpin, say, the First Amendment, to say the more extreme point. I'm talking about countries that will quite cheerfully stand up and say that what we need is laws, for example, against the defamation of religion, that you can't really look for an easy compromise between that idea and the idea that anyone has an absolute and fundamental human right to attack other people's religious views and to say that they're wrong, and to say that you'll burn in hell for disagreeing with me on matters of religion or whatever. There is not a lot of middle ground between those attitudes, and the Googles and the Facebooks and so forth provide direct access to publication of viewpoints in a way that weakens domestic regulation on matters that are culturally important in the views of those governments, and is, to their mind, changing their societies and threatening their societies. And to be perfectly frank, many of those who are on the "no, we want to keep governments out of this and let the internet be free" actually agree with that, and that's why they like it. We need to be, at least amongst ourselves, a bit frank and recognise that that's part of the discussion here. But it's not just about waving placards and wanting to create political protest and wanting to upset people with your point of view, or even exercise your right of freedom of online assembly and all that sort of stuff. It goes beyond that. It goes into much broader areas of policy, and I'll pull out a couple of examples from the ICANN world to support this. One is ICANN's Uniform Dispute Resolution policy. This is a policy by which ICANN manages trademark complaints. You can initiate that process as a trademark holder to say, somebody has registered this domain name, it's infringing my trademark, I want something done about that. Normally I want that trademark reassigned to me. And anyone that registers a domain name, GTLD, has as part of that registration process submitted to be part of this alternative dispute resolution system. That's a non-court resolution system. So that empowers a trademark holder to go to a process that has been set up by ICANN, that is run by ICANN's appointed adjudicators, independent adjudicators, but nonetheless appointed by ICANN or by ICANN processors, to follow a process that was designed as ICANN community policy for the resolution of trademark complaints. Which really means that in the question of domain names, ICANN policy has effectively superseded national trademark law. Now, that's not to say that a trademark holder can't go to court to raise a complaint against somebody for an infringement, but a registrant certainly can't go to court and say, this is a legitimate use of the trademark, even though it's not my trademark, so I want to be able to continue to have this, because they've signed away that right to ICANN to be subject to this ADR system. And if the ADR system decides, no, even this doesn't accord with our policy, then even if a particular national version of trademark law would have allowed that registrant to continue to use the trademark, or maybe provided some other remedy, such as merely promise not to do this particular thing with it again, or just pay this rather derisory form of compensation over. No, they are subject to whatever that the UDRP process results in. Another area, related area to this, again from ICANN, I was talking to people at the ICANN meeting who were from the public health world. I'm not going to go into the details of precisely who they were. I wasn't even always sure exactly who they were representing, but some of them had, a couple of them had some rather sweeping claims of representing more than one intergovernmental organisation on healthcare, which seems unlikely. But basically they were arguing about .pharmacy and .health. And they were concerned that these were being inadequately regulated by ICANN, so that people would be able to have access to registered domains within those top-level domains in an inappropriate fashion that would expose people to thinking that these were legitimate pharmacists, legitimate healthcare professionals, and presumably a sense of that they were properly licensed and so forth, and therefore be able to provide services in a way that you would normally be allowed to provide them, but ICANN wasn't, in their view, stepping up to the plate and making sure that such improper people were excluded from those sensitive and highly regulated domains. Okay, I mean, there were merits and demerits in that position. But what's being asked for here? It seems to me that what's really being asked for is for ICANN to step in to decide who is and is not a properly regulated healthcare professional that should have access to that sort of thing. And that's just in that one area. So you see how these elements of internet policy very quickly stop being about questions of merely freedom of speech. Well, I don't want to say merely freedom of speech, but freedom of speech and political debate and religious debate and assembly, and start coming into the whole gamut of regulatory policy of anything where information is a part of what is being regulated. And when you gradually start to extend controls over content and services, it becomes very difficult to separate the regulation of a purely technical function from the regulation of the social behaviour, especially if you believe that the technical function should have some responsibility to not be abused to create bad social outcomes. But as soon as you take that step, you very quickly get into a place where you're assigning the authority to decide and to set global policy in a very broad area that goes well beyond merely the internet governance aspect. ICANN is particularly important in my view because of the DNS. Because the DNS is one route. The DNS has a tree structure. It is one of the very few things on the internet that is a global tree. It's got a single root, which means that when decisions are taken for the DNS as a whole, really apply on a global basis. Very little else works that way. My organisation provides a connection for internet networks. It allows BT to connect to Virgin, or facilitates BT to connect to Virgin and to connect to AT&T and so forth. But we're just one place where that happens. There are a great many other places where that happens. And the routing on the internet is a highly distributed mechanism. It doesn't go through a central point. There is no centre of the internet. But ICANN is the closest that you can get to that, because ICANN has policy authority for the DNS, at least in the GDPR space. And the DNS needs to work on a global basis. And it needs to be coordinated, and if we are to avoid splitting the groups, which would avoid universal reachability, so long as we accept that as a constraint, and I think that almost everybody does, then there needs to be one set of rules. There are not many other areas in the internet where that happens. You can have, in individual countries, you can have countries giving orders to their ISPs to block access to this content or block access to that content or allow it alternatively. And different countries can take different approaches on that. But in the DNS, with ICANN setting policy there, you've got a single policy authority. That's really quite unique, and that's why I believe it has been such a focus for political engagement, because, as Martin said, people want to lever that to achieve policy outcomes. But the ITU is an alternative approach where you could seek to get a policy declaration for the world. Now, I agree with these gentlemen when they say that isn't going to happen overnight like this. It's not going. You can't expect that, for example, the United States would accept. There's going to be now a new authority set up that's going to have general control of the internet. But that's not really how it works. I mean, it could if they were willing to do it, but they're not, so it's not going to work like that. But it can work other ways, by degrees, by gradual encroachment without really a lot of people being aware of what's going on. For example, last year, 2 years ago, before the Wiki, we had a lot of discussion, a lot of focus on this area. So you would have thought that while everyone was very focused on governments coming together to control the internet, people might have noticed that the week before, within the ITU, a separate meeting of the ITU, that was happening the week before, there was a new standard passed for deep packet inspection. That if you go back and read that standard, basically acts as a how-to guide for content control and censorship. And this was written as a standard to be, which can be applied or not applied, of course, but for those that produce routers to be compliant with that standard, not so that you must apply this form of censorship, but just to make sure that all the equipment has got built-in the capability to support that censorship should the national policy authority decide it. So, on our side of the argument, back in the technical community, the Western business community, frankly, we have a bit of a pretense that these multi-stakeholder institutions like ICANN, like the RILs and so forth, they're mere technical bodies with no, it's not policy really, public policy, we understand that's the role of governments. We're just the car mechanics. Don't worry about us. Please leave us alone, we're just the car mechanics, nothing to worry about. And it's a bit of a pretense, in honest, because the decisions that get made there do have profound implications for the basic architecture, information architecture. But the same is also true, I'll just wrap up. The same is also true on the other side. These decisions, when they're made on the other side, have the same implications as well. And that particular standard is one of them. We are at a time when things are changing, and there are multiple pressures from those that want to move away from the Western standard. The one that's given the most attention right now is what I would call the Russian approach. The idea that we want to have, for example, a cyber security treaty, that we want to have new institutions and so forth. But there's also the Chinese approach. And the Chinese approach looks very much like the IETF approach in reverse. Because I would say that the IETF approach is not really politically neutral, although it claims to be. It's based in a politically neutral technical approach that is grounded in a core set of assumptions and values about what it is to build the internet. The Chinese approach takes the same approach to simply develop technical standards that don't have explicit statements of policy norms in them. That standard on deep packet inspection, in nowhere in it can you find something that says you should censor this or that, or indeed that you should do any censorship at all. But nonetheless, but is grounded in a set of norms and expectations that you need to be able to make these facilities available and make them and design things so that it is more susceptible rather than less susceptible to it. The ITF, this will be my closing point, the ITF in response to the Snowden revelations quickly achieved a consensus that global mass surveillance by governments was a breach of the security of the protocols that they were designing, and that while they did not consider that the ISF was capable of defeating mass surveillance, they did accept and adopt it as their purpose to devise protocols that were proof against that kind of surveillance to the extent that they were capable. That was the objective taken. That is not the sort of approach that you would expect somebody in an ITU-based standards process. I would expect it to be more, we believe that it is appropriate to devise protocols to make them susceptible to that surveillance in the national sovereign interests of the countries that are our member states. So these are not neutral policy choices, but even if they are expressed in neutral terms. We have, I would argue, certain standards and values, whether they are from the civil society side or whether they are the standards of liberal capitalism that certainly my corporate members would expect. There are other standards and values out there, and they're being fought over, and they're not just about the outcomes won't just have implications for the internet, but for the world at large.
Thank you very much. We've covered a lot of territory. It strikes me that we live in a world in which institutional instability is not exactly a new thing, and we are thinking that there might be some kind of solution by next September. We will reorganize the roles and responsibilities of key actors, and it's almost as if he's suggesting that the key actors will play the game appropriately, as if we assign new roles and responsibilities, new institutional formation, and all of a sudden people agree to disagree and everything goes on happily ever after. And it strikes me that hasn't been the case with the internet so far, and it probably won't be in the future. So I guess the question to you that I'd like you to respond to is, what do you actually think are the strategies of some of these key actors, the government ones, who clearly Americans are not going to be able to control their key asset the way they did in the past? Surely they're not going to let it just float away into some amorphous global stakeholder community. Similarly, the Russians, the Chinese, etc., have a particular interest, and they're not going to let it just float away. Neither is the private sector. The internet is scaled up, and it really matters to all of them now for different reasons. So I guess if I could come back to each in order, and then we'll open it up to the floor. If you could talk about what you really think is going to happen, notwithstanding all the talk and all the pixels in between, but what do you think is a solution that would be fair and be some semblance of multi-stakeholderism retained into the future?
I'm not sure there's a fair outcome, just to be clear. It's about power now, so that's something different. I think if you take the US interest, the IANA function was a millstone around their neck. They didn't like it. They didn't feel able to exercise it. They didn't want the ICANN to have issue new high-level domains. US companies didn't want the high-level domains. I think most people saw it as an ICANN tax upon the internet community because existing players had to buy their own domain name to protect it at a high level, and the developing world weren't able to put in many applications, so they felt cheated by the capitalist West. So everyone was unhappy about creating those new high-level domains, and the US government felt it was not able to exercise that authority without people screaming that the US runs the internet. So I think they're very frank about that. They want to get rid of it. They've also been quite frank. Larry Strickland said it publicly in various forums, that if ICANN doesn't come up with a satisfactory process that guarantees, some kind of multi-stakeholderism, i.e. not the Russians and not the Chinese running it, that they feel they have the right to block the transition. They're not necessarily committed to it if there isn't a satisfactory process. I think the Russian goal is a very old-fashioned traditional Cold War goal as Malcolm said, at the policy level of instituting some kind of national, international treaty that enshrines both the traditional doctrine of spheres of influence and national sovereignty, and that it's entirely of a piece with their policy in the Ukraine, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, the Eurasian Union, and a bunch of other diplomacy they're following. As Malcolm says, the smart money should be on the Chinese. They recognise that essentially Western engineers, if I can be crude, Western engineers have built a Western internet that supports and sustains the values common through Europe and North America, and the Chinese will build a different kind of internet that's available, and they'll sell it to whatever country wants to buy that kind of gear, that kind of equipment. So I think the real change will not happen at the global political level, where it will be stymied, but at the engineering level. And we're already seeing, I think, a balkanization of the internet. The Chinese have effectively created the Chinese internet. It's technical, legal, normative, it's the cyber 50-cent army, it's a bunch of things. It's expensive, they've thrown a lot of resource at it, but they've done it. The Iranians would love to do the same thing, a whole bunch of countries would love to do the same thing. So I think that's where the battle will be. It will be an engineering battle. And I couldn't predict the outcome. It's about the power, the role of, the extent to which users are able to exercise a voice in this community, which is where the civil society groups come in, the extent to which somebody in the middle of all this says, what about the users, the user community, the consumer, and where they play, and they could play a significant role even within China and Russia. Users can be very powerful in the internet environment. So I think that community will be decisive. But but if you say what's a fair outcome, I mean there is no fair outcome. It's a battle for who wins control of the most important communication medium since the printing press. A communication medium that's going to redefine the way that every part of our society, from our business, our public services, politics, is going to operate. And there isn't anything more powerful. I mean, now the companies who are internet companies are the biggest companies in the world. The market cap of Apple is bigger than Exxon. Google's rising up fast. In 20 years' time, these companies will dominate the FTSE 500 by any imagination. So you've got the biggest money, the biggest power, the most significant invention in probably 100 years, and it's, and you want a fair outcome? I mean, that's not what it's going to be.
I'm a Canadian, that's why I'm an optimist, but I'm not naive either, so. You want to comment?
Well, first of all, I think I would certainly agree with 2 points that Andrew made. Specifically, agree with these. Firstly, about the IANA becoming a millstone around the US government's neck. It feels like power, but you try doing something with it. If you were to try and take out North Korea, then wouldn't you be responsible for breaking the internet? Meanwhile, everybody reviles you for having this control over the internet. And the other point I strongly agree with him on is this idea of fair outcome. I think probably for me, I would say there's an awful lot of people who feel very, very comfortable with the US being the country that's holding the pieces of string that hold ICANN in place. Because that immediately brings those companies under US jurisdiction, and I think the jurisdiction issue is going to be vital as we move forward. Because it's not just where you fight your court battles if something goes wrong. It might also mean whether the organisation that's just screwed you over has indemnity. One of the problems of international organisations very often is that they have got legal indemnity, so you can't do anything about it. And I think fitting in there, the US government's approach of backing the multi-stakeholder community is that it sees that sort of multi-stakeholder community as being the muggins who's standing in between the key pieces that you want to protect and those people who want to snatch it. You know, can the multi-stakeholder environment do this? What happens if it doesn't work? And I've always had this sort of private theory that, well, actually, you know, if something were to go wrong with the IANA, well, there are probably other ways of doing it that are cooperative agreements between the people who are essentially disseminating the information that is in the root that then the users can draw on, so they still get unique access to the resource that they have asked for.
Yeah, just a couple of very brief reactions there. One optimistic, one pessimistic, and mainly coming from Andrew's comments. I don't think there's going to be a Chinese internet. People are always talking, my entire career so far, people have been talking about building a new internet, an internet 2, and got great projects for how it's going to achieve something, usually technical, that will be better. And sometimes they build it. And as soon as they build it, the users of that network demand it gets connected to the real internet, and there's part of the internet. Because the clue is in the word, it is the first two syllables. The internet connects between networks. And the internet is made up of different networks, and every time you connect another one to it, it joins the whole. So that's what's going to happen. So the real question in the Chinese approach isn't whether they can build something that's separate, it's whether the internet as a whole will gradually take on a more Chinese flavour. Whether, for example, all our routers will come with DPI systems built in, and it will make people like my members, the ISPs, make it hard for them to turn around to governments and say, oh no, it'd be very difficult for us to do all that control and blocking of stuff. It would really harm our businesses, and we'd be too expensive and very difficult technically to achieve. It's like, no, all we're asking you to do is implement this system, this set of config files in the standard DPI system that's been built into every modern router now, as thanks to ITU standard Y3, whatever it was. That's the approach that I mean by a Chinese internet, not just a separate thing behind a great firewall. The pessimistic point is drawing from Andrew's argument that it is hard for democratic governments to engage in this debate, to stand up to the non-democratic governments. And I certainly perceive this, and that's big, and that's because of this. No governments go along to something like an ITU implementation conference with the purpose of breaking up the conference and having a disagreement and it all falling apart in chaos. You go there to try and reach an agreement. And that puts the democratic governments as a systematic disadvantage, because they've got problems with the internet too. They're concerned about terrorism and paedophilia and fraud and all kinds of things, legitimate concerns. And so all the non-democratic governments have to do is find a way of showing the democratic governments that some progress could be made on the issues that we all have in common if you provide these mechanisms that will give us, together, the opportunity to work together to address them, which is about transferring more ability to control behaviour, actions and content into the hands of policy-making authority and escape the jurisdictional arbitrage that the international nature of the internet has created that has weakened that policy authority. And so, in that sense, I would say, democratic governments are compromised because they have the desire to uphold fundamental standards and values, but they also have the same desires to address specific policy challenges that non-democratic governments do. And they can't, in an international context like the ITU, insist on those challenges being addressed only in ways consistent with democratic norms and values, because you can write that in to the statement, or it should be done that way, but you don't actually have any practical mechanism for achieving it.
Thank you. The floor is open. Philip.
Philip Virgo. I don't think my other reason for agreeing very strongly with Malcolm's points, found very good indeed. One of the reasons the Chinese don't want another internet is that 40% of us already access the internet through Chinese equipment. And for them to get to that position, they had to include within their switches all the NATO-mandated surveillance facilities. So we do indeed have a seamless internet, and will have, with everything built into it, for heaven and or hell, depending on how we actually use it. And my particular point is, my optimistic view is, we will not see any stitch-ups over the next year, and the muddle will continue ad infinitum. And that is also my pessimistic viewpoint. Long may the muddle continue, because as soon as it's sorted out, oh boy, will we have to live with some very nasty consequences.
Yes. Yeah.
Ian Hargreaves. Going right back to something that Andrew said at the beginning of his opening remarks, you, just the way you put it, lumped together America and Europe as being on the same side about all of this. I wonder whether you think that that is likely to remain the case, or whether you identify divergent tendencies between those two particular parts of the democratic world.
I think on some discrete issues, I mean, data protection and privacy is a very significant gulf between the US and Europe in core values, really. And I think there's no evidence that that gap's going to close on that issue. So there have been some European ideas about data localization. You know, some people have floated the idea of a European cloud, whereby European data will only be held within European jurisdictions rather than global jurisdictions. And I don't personally think that's likely to go anywhere. I mean, it's impossible to say, because I think once you politicise the architecture in that way, it causes a lot of problems, and there'll be massive corporate resistance. But that could happen. So I think within some discrete areas you could see some divergent policy interests, but on the broad IG issues, then going back, I think as Virgo said, probably the interest of the US and Europe to keep the current muddling on in a fairly inconclusive way, and actually let's not arrive at a destination, because if we arrive at a destination, it will be a place we didn't want to be. I think I don't see any real distinction between the governments that I see, and I work with Britain, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, one or two others in Europe and the US, and I see no distinction between them on that core issue.
If I can just turn to the infrastructure level, I can actually see there perhaps being, again, a polarisation as there was during towards the end of the World Summit process between the US and Europe. I think what I'm seeing is that, and this picks up again on Philip Virgo's, well, muddle is good for us because it stops anything happening. I actually do think that for Europe as a whole, failure would be seen as leading to the status quo, and the status quo as not being acceptable. That in its March statement, NTIA took the cork out of the bottle and out came genie. And I think expectations are now raised for something that has been in European policy, including UK policy, since the end of the 90s, and that is that there should be the globalisation of the management of the what are now called critical internet resources. And I think sort of US turning around and saying, well, you haven't done what you were going to do, this is a failure, and therefore we'll carry on doing it, would provoke quite a strong reaction from Europe that here is a promise unfulfilled.
Well, I mean, I just think that we should just admit that to talk about the American interest, the European interest, the Western interest, these terms are broad, gross generalizations. As you get into specific elements of the policy and the specific elements of the policy debate, you can easily unpick those and see divergences. But certainly in what I spoke about earlier, I was inviting you to take a sort of 20-year, 30-year view of the way that policy is developing generally, rather than next year, how it's going to work, what the position is going to be on NTIA transition. If you take that long time frame view, I would say that there is much more in common between within Europe, for example, or between Europe and the United States, than there is with some of the, for example, Arab states or Russia or China. Now, there will be areas where you can actually even say maybe that's not even true, but they'll be in the specifics. Broadly speaking, in the arch of it, we are capitalist societies, and we're societies that believe in a form of limited government, and some of those are not appreciated the same way, and the implications of that from other areas, and that has broader consequences. But you can always find, I mean, to be honest, half the time I think that France is on the other side, so
I did have a French diplomat say to me once, we have a treaty for everything, why not the internet? And it was a sort of philosophical proposition. I think the other point about the muddle is, I think that's probably the goal, but no one can quite express it like that. You know, no diplomat will stand up and say, our job is to make sure that nothing really gets resolved. It's going to be a mess if it does. So it does create a quandary for the diplomats who have to effectively pursue that position.
I think it also opens up space for saying that while we think we're muddling through, all sorts of things actually are happening. And as you suggest, technology is being designed, new generations, whether it's DPI or whatever else it is, might be a new technical skill, it might be, I think you referred to the fragmentation of different parts of the internet. And so actors are doing things. Power doesn't just sort of sit still and say, oh, aren't we happy today? The internet is changing. And I'm sure all of you are here because you have quite strong feelings about just exactly what changes you would not like to see happen. So maybe some of you would like to express some of those strong feelings. Yes?
So this might be a little more specific, but I was wondering what you think would be the pros and cons of structurally separating the IANA and the ICANN into two separate organizations versus kind of keeping the IANA as a separate subsidiary while placing limits on the ICANN.
I think for me, and yes, you're right. You know, this is one of the big debates that people are currently skirting around on this. But I think for me, the transition has got to be based on a good basis of understanding of what it is you want to achieve. You know, and that includes safeguards against things going wrong, and it means making sure that you've got your accountability right. But it also means that you know, sort of day one of new code coming into power, it just doesn't fall flat on its face because somebody forgot to order the toner cartridges. And so, for me, the separating policy from operation is the fundamental thing. Whether you do that structurally or just functionally, and I'd say at the moment it's functionally separated, and then how do you reinforce that? Nobody who I've heard championing structural separation has yet convinced me that it solves a specific problem, but I'm ready to be convinced. I think in other worlds, we have seen functional separation being put in place and it working. And I'm pretty damn sure if I look carefully, I find a few cases where functional separation being put in place and it really made a mess of it. And I think we've really just got to try and work out, well, what are the safeguards you need to put behind it? It's one of those issues of, well, all of a sudden, haven't we just implemented a regulator? Who is the regulator? And by and large, a regulator is in place, answerable to the government, or rather, answerable to Parliament.
There are three areas here, names, numbers, and protocols. And for protocols and numbers, ICANN's not the policy authority, and structural separation there is practically in place already, really, arguably. You know, the RIR, certainly in numbers, the RIRs are already the policy authority, but they're also pretty much the order giver to IANA, not the order taker. The NRO is already in place to do that. I think the practical consequences of such separation will be negligible. There is a possibility of a short-term political reaction if it's seen as splitting up and maybe a loss of confidence in ICANN being signalled or pretended to be signalled for political reasons and that. But the practical consequence in that area is negligible. In names, it's not quite the same. In names, ICANN is the policy authority, and that's the concern, whether it has sufficient accountability. And the reason to suggest structural separation is really being pushed to provide an alternative means, an additional means of accountability. Accountability to the policy-making process. Well, now you've got potentially two sources of authority to the IANA function. ICANN, which is vested with the policy authority, and whatever accountability mechanism you've put over this structurally separated IANA, that's a recipe for confusion, not really great. One of the big conundrums with addressing the NTIA transition and putting in place the appropriate improvements and accountability needed to replace the US's stewardship role is how to achieve that accountability over that policy-making authority without creating infinite regression of authority.
Thank you for being LSE across the project. I just want to come back to Philip Virgo's terrifying suggestion that muddle might be good as an academic, which has an instinctive mistrust of muddles. But it's a bit cup half full and cup half empty, isn't it? Because we can think about where the muddle has got us. We can think about the fact that during this muddle there have been various kinds of standard setting which have been basically tooling for filtering, blocking and surveillance. I think we've heard of some examples in IANA and the ICANN function have slightly stayed outside of that. But going forward, I mean, there are real questions about whether you continue with that model, especially if you, given the fact that there also seem to be moments when what's been described by the panel as a sort of normative approach to engineering and standard setting has actually tried to put a brake on that process. I think for civil society groups and campaigners, there are questions about, you know, the big questions which have divided them around whether to work through international organisations proper, or whether to stick with a multi-stakeholder process. We have to think through, in the next phase, given where that muddle is taking us, is there any positive way in which turning to that normative approach within what seems to be still very powerful North American and European, generally internet companies, are standard setting, and how, if that's what should be encouraged, those blocking points and those moments where engineering principles, normative principles, can be encouraged. And isn't that the big question? And maybe to sort of encourage some of the panel to get off the fence a bit. I mean, where do they think they would advise campaign groups to go on those big issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There's a big role for normative standard setting, and I think it's the key thing for civil society groups. I think, insofar as there are various networks which I'm part of that try and coordinate civil society activity, and I would say where we've got to is recognising there's a fundamental problem, firstly, in the business model of the internet, that it's a surveillance model. You know, companies. It's a very interesting article by Houghton in Atlantic, which some of you may have seen, where he talks about writing the first piece of code for pop-up ads, which he said at the time was just their way of monetising the internet and figuring out a way of getting people to pay for it. And they had no idea of returning to the industry it is now, where essentially, because nobody pays for search, nobody pays for using the internet, companies gather as much information about you as they can and marketise it and sell it. And I've heard GCHQ, protest vigorously that they do a lot less surveillance than the average internet company. So what are people so neurotic about? There are companies that know far more about you than the intelligence services do, which I'm sure is factually correct. So I think there's a set of issues there which at the moment have no real home. So I think for a lot of us, the first task, if you like, intellectually in policy terms, is to define what I would call a human rights-based infrastructure for the internet. What would an infrastructure for the internet that supported and sustained core human rights values and dignity and democracy, what would that look like? What would the changes that would need to be made to actually build that kind of environment? And what are the norms that would then need to grow to shape the behaviour of engineers and policymakers, both at regional, national and global level? So I think where we are is, some people are coming in on specific issues like privacy and surveillance, which is banging as a massive concern around civil society groups around the world. But I think the more fundamental question is to think about the internet that we would want, that would support and sustain the values that we want, which with respect to the founders of the internet, and it's been a brilliant invention, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, is essentially increasingly enshrining a kind of corporate monopoly power, which is not identical, however much the companies would like to say it is identical with the public interest. And the public interest, access to information and ideas and flow. So I think we need to define that. And that infrastructure would be technical, and I think it would be commercial, and I think it would be regulatory. And I think it would have all of those aspects. This is not the right place to do that, but we had some thinking and we have some thoughts about what the engineering of the human rights internet, what the commercial environment would look like, and what the political and regulatory environment would be. And I think that's where I would start. We need to get that kind of debate going within the broader internet community to try and shape and drive the debates forward. Otherwise, the model will just hand us over to, in the end, I don't really want to choose between Apple running the world and Russia running the world. Neither of them are particularly attractive choices for me personally.
Which, I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking, if we had our students in the room, we always tell them you can't separate policy and the engineering side of things, even though in practice they sometimes seem like they're separable. But in reality, there's so much at stake and so many normative values that crop up across this peculiar infrastructure that it's very difficult to achieve that. I'll hand the mic back. You look like you want to say something, but would you like to take another comment first and then I'll come back to you?
Sally brought this also in the project. I have kind of two questions. The first one is on this issue of human rights. Don't we have human rights instruments for everything else in our governance of society that have already kind of been agreed upon that can somehow just be applied? And isn't it more an issue of who's actually holding those things to account? Because we have, say, international courts, we have various things where at least there may be some attempts to hold human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, etc. These things together. Isn't it more about who are we actually tasking to do that? And then that leads me to this other question. I'm surprised that the IGF hasn't really come up much. And we mentioned WISTIS only sort of in the historical part at the beginning, and I've read actually Robin's report from WISTIS and stuff. There are things going on where there have been some principles set down. There have been that are based on human rights, values, some of the stuff that you're talking about. At the IGF, there's a lot of different groups out there defending things. I haven't been, I've just read about it. But it seems like there's a lot of these different voices, but there's not necessarily the place that you go. So do we really need more instruments, or do we just need to know who we're actually calling upon?
Yes, okay. I might actually skirt a little round human rights before I, just like any good government might. I think one of the things that sort of worries me about internet governance is that it means all things to all men. It's a little bit like that bit in Alice in Wonderland where Humpty Dumpty says, when I use the word internet governance, I use it to mean exactly what I want it to mean, neither more nor less. And I think that's what we sort of tend to do. We produce this thing that ends up as a massively big basket and that starts then encroaching into the real world and then sort of produces this illusion that we can resolve for the internet those things that we were vaguely unhappy with or perhaps very content, but we didn't like the way the other person was interpreting them in the real world. And I think to some extent, sort of trying to break internet governance down into more discrete functions and then saying, well, how are these dealt with in the real world? And now I sort of pick up on the human rights thing in particular. And saying, well, okay, now, do we really need to produce a whole new case law of human rights? Do we need to produce a new instrument for human rights? And I suspect in the case law we do, but in the new instruments we don't. And I suspect actually if we go into human rights treaty for the internet, we will end up in a worse position from a Western point of view than we are at the moment. And that probably sort of helps underline why the IGF in some eyes is not going anywhere. I think the IGF is still in that stage of people going through the IGF and airing discussions and listening to what other people are saying and starting to understand the issues that relate the sort of body of agreements that we have in the real world into, well, how does that map into the internet? And therefore at some stage, perhaps there is a mark where you can start saying, well, actually, this is an area where we really do need to understand what the implications of the internet are in that sort of wider context. Going back to something that had me smirking when Andrew was talking about it, he said that the internet, he thoroughly enjoyed it. Past tense. Oh dear, we've already got there.
Andrew, I don't get to disagree with you very often, but you just pushed one of my buttons, so I'll enjoy this. I want to completely reject any sense of moral equivalency between an internet run by Putin and an internet run by Apple. And I know you didn't really mean it that way. I know you didn't really mean it that way, but actually when civil society is asserting its case, it often does come across that way rather, and governments or at least not just governments, but others who are not coming from your viewpoint, make use of that and manipulate that to focus away from genuine human rights abuses or genuine structural and structural problems in rights mechanisms and enforcement mechanisms and decision and dispute management mechanisms and justice mechanisms, to focus attention away from that and towards what are relatively trivial issues that ought to be addressed, but are relatively, we need to keep a sense of proportion about by the corporate world. At the end of the day, you know, Google wants to sell me a better brand of coffee. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's scary how much data they've got about me, but at the end of the day, their evilness is limited. Yeah, if the worst that they're going to do is sell me a better brand of coffee, the government wants to take 40% of my income and it wants to inspect how I bring up my children to decide whether to take them away from me or not. Yeah, this is a completely different level, and that's why human rights laws are addressed. Human rights is addressed to controlling government power, not corporate power. Corporate power does exist and does need to be regulated, and it is a legitimate subject of discussion. But it is on a different level, and rightly so. When we are at a point, certainly in my opening words, I try to convince you that we are at a point that is such a fundamental new development in terms of the way that policy is made on a global level with much less national and regional ability to set individual policies, but we are coming together the opportunity to have a much more globalized power where you don't get the opportunity to escape from it. These are what I would argue far more important area of focus for those that are concerned about the rights of citizens than some of the things that equal time is given to, and I'm concerned about that. Now, I agree with everything Martin said about the need for, or lack of need for new human rights standards, but in terms of mechanisms to address how those rights are actually enjoyed and given effect to and protected from things that encroach on them, I think there's plenty to do. I mean, you know, I think that the people halfway up a mountain in what we might call Kurdistan would agree with us on that.
Just to be clear, I want political choice and I want consumer choice. They're not of the same moral order, and I'm not suggesting they are. And I think I want both. That seems to me totally reasonable. I think on the IGF, I think is like a political party conference in Britain. It's quite a lot of fun because you meet all your mates. You hang out in the bars and talk to each other. The main policy discussions are utterly pointless and boring because no one's going to listen to them. So the IGF is basically very good as a hangout, and I think fairly worthless as an instrument for driving policy. But I go every year, and my staff go because we like hanging out with people we know and doing a lot of business on the margins, and that's what it is. I think, in terms of human rights, I think the standards do exist. I don't think we need new standards. I think it would be very dangerous to create new human rights for a technological platform. And I think that debate, which had run for a while, and 10 years ago, is now dead. But I think the problem is the human rights movement doesn't really understand the internet. It's a 20th century movement run by hierarchically structured, paper-based organisations who have not adjusted to the modern world. And I know them and love them. I'm from the human rights movement, but I can tell you they don't get it at all. And so it needs to be, if you like, politely explained to them what a human rights architecture would look like. They would probably get it's about encryption, technically. They'd probably get it's about not having a kill switch. They wouldn't understand why you need multiple internet exchange points, for example, as part of a human rights architecture. You'd need to kind of explain that a little bit. At the same time, they wouldn't necessarily understand that you need a certain commercial environment. That actually having strong anti-monopoly legislation is quite a good thing. Having legislation that allows the entry of new entrants into the market and facilitates those entrants actually is consistent with human rights values. I mean, these things are not necessarily, because they're in the realm of commerce, not necessarily obvious to human rights people. So I think you're right that we don't need new standards, but there's a lot of work to do to explain what it means to apply human rights in this particular architecture and this particular commercial environment. I mean, we don't have a human rights architecture in the UK, which means I don't get the internet in Norfolk. You know, I can't get a good mobile signal in whole chunks of London. I get better 4G in Lagos than I do in the capital city of this country. That's because it's not been designed properly, and BT have had the bloody monopoly because useless government policies have handed the monopoly of the infrastructure over to British Telecom. Now, I think that's a human rights issue, and not that I have a human right to it, but I think it's ridiculous that there are people in this country who cannot access a basic piece of infrastructure when the government has set a policy of we're digital by default. So government policies are digital by default, but there's a whole chunk of this country that can't access that digital platform. How is that consistent with human rights norms and values? It's not. There's a commercial failing in the heart of UK policy, which I think has a direct democratic and human rights consequence. So I won't bang on anymore, but I think a lot of work needs to be done to explain what we mean by applying human rights in the internet environment.
With your permission, I am the chair, but I think I'll get carried away just for a second. It strikes me that if you cast your minds back to 25, 30 years ago, and we'd be having the same debate about the consequences of another technical infrastructure, which was the telecommunications infrastructure. And as soon as you started debating content and conduit, to use the sort of more North American expression, versus, you know, public interest and value in public service broadcasting versus whether or not anybody should interfere with this thing called CCIP architecture, you get this revving up, and the default seems to be, let's talk about process. Let's talk about how we can organize this institutionally. You're making a strong stand on particular values, but it seems to me that we've always been talking about these issues, and somehow we single out the internet because it's global, I suppose, but it wasn't telegraphy, it wasn't telecoms infrastructure. Because it's global, we say, it's difficult. We have to have newly defined roles. Now, I know at the level of all of the individuals and the way it came into being in the first place, that it was done in a very open and largely engineering-driven way. But that's not where we are today. Now we have this tension between content and conduit, and we're all struggling with what should be done. How do we get human rights, values respected, etc.? And it seems to me that if you sat in any setting and talked about technical aspects of a telecoms infrastructure, or indeed broadcasting, you have to explain to many, many of those people who were involved in developing it what was meant by human rights, what was meant by ethical conduct online, etc. So I guess what I'm saying in a sort of provocative way, I hope, is it really all that different? Are we actually creating a problem when the real problem is that people really don't want to face some of these contradictions? They don't really want to face the fact that human rights will be somewhat thrown out the window if nobody takes responsibility for the development of this infrastructure that we care about. Any responses? And anybody want to say something?
Yeah,
I'll say something. I'd like to say something.
it is different.
Yes, I'm going to say that.
And it's different for the reason that I gave at the beginning of my own remarks. Absent intervention to the contrary, anyone can get onto YouTube and they can see all the stuff on YouTube. There's a lot of laws against a lot of the stuff on YouTube, not to mention everywhere else. So the ability to bring whatever anybody wants to say, whatever content anyone wants to deliver, whatever assemblies people want to organise, and all the services and stuff that they want to provide, to the door of someone in a country that says that stuff ain't allowed, challenges that country in a way that access to the telephone never did. And the television was always a centrally controlled infrastructure. It was always a tool for power, not for undermining power. And so I think it is very different. Whichever side of the argument you're on, the impact is just not the same.
Yeah, I agree. Those were both print and broadcast grew up in national medium subject to national legislation, and the battle has been to liberalise and free them up over a generation. The internet's permissionless innovation. Anyone sticks the bit on and grows it. It traded on the existing telecoms infrastructure, so nobody had to build it anew. There were no licenses required to start launching products or broadcasting. You just went ahead and did it. And so it's grown from 150,000 to 3 billion in 20 years at a pace that radio, TV and print could never compare to. So it's a fundamentally, and with the advantages that Malcolm brings, I think it's a fundamentally different kind of medium to one that's gone before.
It's the many-to-many versus one-to-many.
Yes, peer-to-peer and viral rather than hierarchical.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. But I think there's something else that's happening and is possible because of the internet. And Malcolm referred to this early on in his intervention. And that is that the organisations, the businesses that run the internet, certainly are seen by the government as being part of the infrastructure that can be used to impose the law. And so, yes, you know, as a company, we do get approached by law enforcement agencies to take action. And most of the time, yes, you know, there is something criminal going on. The criminal, you don't know who he is, you don't know where he is, you don't even know necessarily who the victims are, and yet you're being asked to do something about it. So you start being into a bit of a quandary. Now, what happens when that law is not about child abuse, but is about following a Chinese sect or mentioning Tiananmen Square, and then all of a sudden these businesses are essentially, from being asked to help the law enforcement, suddenly find themselves being made responsible for taking on a role of law enforcement. And that is actually something that I do find deeply worrying, and something that as a society we probably do need to start thinking about, you know, where is law actually being, you know, so who is going to be responsible for doing the law enforcement.
And it raises an interesting comparison, if I may very quickly, that makes it a very interesting comparison between print and the internet as opposed to broadcast and telegraphy. Because print, when it first came along, at least in the European context, I don't know about the Chinese context, I'm afraid, but in the European context, print was very much a subversive medium in its initial stages. It very much undermined the power of the Catholic Church as the sole source of information on the most important information of the day. And then it was co-opted by censorship mechanisms, mainly based around copyright and co-opting the printers. And now we've got the tussle over whether the internet is going to be something that is very much putting a subversive technology in the way that I described it a moment ago, or whether the ability of governments to apply regulatory power to intermediaries gives them leverage to scale control over citizens in a way that they never had the power to practically enforce that level of fine-grained control in the past. And so maybe the internet could go in a direction which is more restrictive, as indeed for a while print did.
Philip, I saw your hand up, and then Damien, and then just so you all know, we're kind of aiming to finish in about 10 minutes or so, to go upstairs with the drinks. So we'll take comments from the audience.
Yes, I want to speak a little bit more about muddle as a positive force, not just a negative one. But to begin with, the point that I was on IFIP in the early 1980s when we welcomed the Russians into membership. And one of the key things to remember about the changes that took place in Russia was that they began with the Moscow Olympics, because for a period of about 3 to 4 months, including the run-up, there were 4 times as many international phone lines into Moscow as the KGB had English-speaking surveillance operations. The GB was never put back into the bottle. But at that point you can understand these issues go back a long way. When Tim Berners-Lee was accepting his freedom and the City of London, he talked about the issues going back to the Hanseatic League, the tensions between those who are trying to do things internationally and governments. I've written on the tensions between warlords and the international trade, going back to the contrast between ancient Sumeria and Egypt. These things go back a very long way, and the great thing about Muddle is that it has actually allowed the internet to evolve in ways that would never otherwise have happened. The way in which the IETF functions in its evolutionary manner is very important. And one of the evolutions that's going on at the moment, which I find quite intriguing, with regard to data protection, virtually all of the data protection legislations we've got actually limit the ability of us to sue for damages under tort. We've actually got to prove expenses. The lawyers are now in the process of finding ways around this so that you don't have to prove damages. You can get £500, £600, £750, maybe a couple of grand for distress if your privacy has been invaded. Now, the insurance companies are currently looking at this for the implications for class actions against somebody who has a data breach loss. Now, that's going to lead to a whole set of evolutions in attitudes on the part of service providers. And my great concern is that if we do try and sort out, and we know what we want, we may fall victim to that great Chinese curse of may you get what you asked for. The more the internet is available to evolve, and evolve in ways that we can't actually predict, I think for the better. But then it's actually incumbent on us to try and ensure it evolves in the way that we would like to see it evolve.
There's a paradox there.
Yes, absolutely.
Damien, and then we'll take one of our comments.
I'm having a bit of difficulty reconciling the objective of muddling through and its implication that we should do nothing with your optimism about glasnost and perestroika and the importance of bringing telephones to Russia. I think there may have been other factors involved in that particular historical change of telephones. But to link it to Andrew's point, which I've been struggling with a bit, I want to believe that the central objective should be to design some principles that enable us somehow to derive engineering and design principles from human rights principles. I want to believe that that's true, that's the way to go. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because I can imagine designing an internet on the basis of one human rights principle, Article 19, freedom of expression. I think you mainly were referring to that. But of course, this is not an absolute right. There are important balancing roles and balancing functions. And that is where the difficulty comes. Are they, and I think this is your point, is that are they located in private hands? Are they transparently adjudicated, and are those disputes dealt with transparently? Is there due process? Are there rights for people? All of those questions, which I think we're seeing in Google's current advisory group on the right to be forgotten, kind of a slightly worrying emergent mono-stakeholderism, and I think the companies themselves are beginning entirely sure that it's as simple as designing human rights based engineering principles. Although I want it to be true.
Okay, last round for each of you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. when I said human rights infrastructure, I didn't mean to say that's purely technical. Maybe the word infrastructure is wrong. I meant it would have a technical, commercial, and a policy and legal aspect. And I think some of the issues you dealt with, I don't think censorship, for example, or the necessary controls on speech should be a technical question. I think it should be a legal question that's enforced through a jurisdiction. And there shouldn't be an automatic algorithm that decides this speech violates this norm. And therefore, algorithmically, with no interference from with no due process, that decision's made. I don't think it should be a commercial decision by a company that just decides, well, we think this is a bit dodgy, so let's take it down and prohibit someone from seeing it. I think there should be a proper due process when speech is being restricted. So maybe I did not explain myself properly. For me, a human rights infrastructure has that technical, commercial, and legal and political dimension to it, and they intertwine.
I must admit, I sort of do share Damien's concerns. It seems to me that it becomes quite dangerous for it to come down to the company having to make decisions. Much of the information that it needs to make the decisions it won't have access to. And essentially it puts the organisations into a heads the government wins, tails the business loses scenario. Certainly not a direction I'd like to go down. But I suppose for my concluding sort of point, I think I would actually continually go back to, well, the problem with the internet is jurisdiction. It becomes very, very hard for us to say, well, okay, legal constraints on speech, when what might be a legal constraint on speech in the UK is going to be different to that in the US, and certainly, well, at least for the moment, made remain to be the case that it is significantly different from China or Saudi Arabia. So somehow or other we need to start understanding the implications of jurisdiction and the liability and responsibility and this is where the internet is different to the printed word. The printed word you've got to smuggle over a border, whereas the electronic word, well, if you put a block up somewhere, it'll find a way around it. That's what it was designed to do.
Yeah, I agree. Ultimately, it is the jurisdiction thing. In answer to your comments about whether it's really different, that was really the essence of the answer I gave. Jurisdictional arbitrage is a real challenge to government regulation, both that we would like to support and that we have less respect for. And it's not just about speech. If I am a shopkeeper in the UK or a supermarket or something that is selling lockets, thread pastels, should I be allowed to send them out to somebody in another country that has bought them on my site? Or should I be required to take responsibility for checking whether or not they're allowed to buy them from me? Why should I be responsible for doing that for the benefit of some other country and some other government to whom I owe no duty? But if you say I don't have any such responsibility, then my presence and willingness to do that is actively undermining what's a perfectly legitimate piece of regulation of potentially hazardous substances on the part of that country. These are not easy questions. And I use that example, even if it's a rather trivial and made-up one, to show that this isn't just about speech.
Thank you very much. We're going to close now. I think there's one word that is rattling around in my head, and that is the word accountability, which stakeholders are accountable to whom? Have we seen the end of the end of jurisdictional accountability in the nation-state sense? What about corporate entities and their interests? And heaven forbid that civil society organizations have lost their way in terms of being able to articulate a third way, if you like, or a third position. So I'd like to thank all of you tremendously. Just before we close, I'd like to say what I should have said at the start. If you're wondering where Sarah Taylor is, she sent her apologies. She's from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. She came down with the flu, unfortunately. So she would have been with us otherwise. So thank you again. Thank you all to all of you for coming, and join us upstairs for things.
Thank you. And just a couple of words. We recorded, we missed a little bit of the beginning, but we recorded all of the proceeds. We had between 25 and 30 people watching this remotely from around the world, so it's been quite well followed. And the recordings will be available, or at least the link to the recordings will be available on the ISOC England website, which is isoc-e.org. I think that's the one question, yeah. So isoc-e.org. So thanks very much. Thanks to everyone, and thanks of course to Jean-Jacques Sayed and the IIC and to London School of Economics for making this available and possible. Thanks.
We'll be circulating a note with the website so that you can find it.
Okay.
On there, yeah. And to the list upstairs to the 8th floor. Thank you very much.
Singer was nice.
Wow. Very nice.